I'm Stuart Stevens, and I'm incredibly excited to be joined by a guy who I am just a straight up, I'm not going to try to hide it, fanboy of, and have been for a long time, Stephen Besloff. Um, Stephen, thanks for doing this, man.
Well, this is
Um,
my pleasure, to say the least.
to just start, everybody who's watching this who doesn't subscribe to Stephen's Substack, America, America, really should. You can find it to that title. I guess it comes up under your name as well. It's the way Substack works, right?
Right.
Um, what I really like about it is when I start a piece, I'm not sure exactly what it's going to say, which is really rare for some of us who feel like we write the same three pieces over and over,
Mm.
so much so that we could just say, well, this is number two. And there's really no need for me to write it out. But you really have this ability. Well, it's like Orville says, to be interesting, you have to be interested, and you're incredibly interested. Um, But
Thank
look,
you.
I gotta, you gotta humor me here for a minute. I gotta go through some of your background because it's the most amazing. You are what my mother wanted me to be. This incredibly varied career. You've been a foreign correspondent. You've worked in film. You wrote a book, The Gunman and His Mother, about Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother, which I stumbled on because I had read my old friend Hampton Side's book on
The
on
great
Lee Harvey.
Hampton.
Yeah, well, I love Hampton. We have this Mississippi connection,
Yeah.
and an Outside Magazine connection.
Hellhound on the, I have to, I'm jumping ahead, but the Hellhound on the Trail, in some ways I was really influenced by that book, which is about James Earl Ray and the, assassination of Martin Luther King. And, it's about two-thirds of the way through the book before you really, or maybe halfway, you get to the assassination. I mean, he really takes the time to, introduce you to
Yeah,
James Earl Ray and his world, and then slowly these two very disparate worlds begin to intersect, and that was fascinating.
yeah. That's what made me. He goes into his background, which that's what
Mm.
drew me to your book. The idea that we're doing that. Yeah, you've been nominated for Pulitzers. I mean, it's just done all this amazing stuff now. And now, I mean, you taught at the Walter Cronkite School in at Arizona,
I'm
which
doing this at NYU now, so
I didn't realize that. I mean, Arizona
yeah,
just seems to be an amazing place, the Cronkite
it
School,
is, yeah.
um, and now at NYU.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. And you're have relocated to the East Coast.
Oh, that's true. That's true. I'm experiencing, as I told you, I'm experiencing, autumns and winters and springs, all in succession, one after another, like in full for the first time in 25 years. After being on the West Coast, and it's kind of spectacular for somebody who's gotten accustomed to having 330 days of sunshine.
Yeah, I I went to film school out in LA and kind of half still spend time in Santa Monica. And I find it appallingly pleasant, but very disturbing if you're not there for very long. Um,
Yeah,
well,
it's
look,
it's also about, if I can just say, as long as
yeah,
we're doing this, it's about light also. I mean, I lived for 4 years in Finland, and I spent time north of the Arctic Circle. And if you're there in the winter, there's a couple of months where the sun doesn't come over the horizon, and you get this kind of gorgeous refracted light for a small number of hours of the day. And so
right,
I'm very aware of the different kinds of light in different places. There, it's this kind of surgically silver, clear, precise, beautiful, sort of intellectual light, as opposed to the gauzy, numbing light of Los Angeles.
yes. So I don't want to get distracted here, but I kind of follow up on this because I'm a big Finland. I spend time there. I love it. Where were you and why were you there?
Well, I mean, I was based in Helsinki. I went through, I was there sort of in the years right around the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I was there right before the collapse, tried to go to then Leningrad, couldn't, the
Right.
trains were stopped because of the coup attempt from Moscow. Ended up going to Tallinn instead in Estonia. It's 50 miles across the Gulf of Finland, and it was the week after the Estonians had declared independence from the Soviet Union, and so it
Wow.
was a and did a big piece, as it turned out, for the Village Voice at the time. And it was just to sort of tell the story about how they were coping and their ideas about the future and, what was happening. And that really excited me about spending more time there because I felt like, I'm too young to have been around for the birth of the Soviet Union and the rise of world communism, but I was, old enough to be there for the end of the world communism and the end of the Soviet Union, and to see what happens when, in essence, one day you wake up and your country no longer exists.
Yeah.
And now what, right? Everything changed. All the rules, 60 rubles that was a month's salary became, enough to buy a couple of Snickers bars. So everything was sort of open. And so, I mean,
And
and
so
that,
let me ask you, I talked to some people, Tom Nichols has written about this, I
mm,
thought very interestingly, um, ab- about how he felt a real sense of hope then, that
mm.
there really, that this could be the beginning of something
Oh
new for the
yeah.
Soviet Union. Did you
Oh
experience that? Was that your
Oh
feeling?
yeah, well, because that whole first period, I mean, there was so much of a feeling, the yearning to be free, the yearning to be part of the West, the yearning to be part of, the larger world in a way that they had been cut off for so long. And so, there was a hunk, when a foreigner came, you were really treated like a hero almost because people were sort of so hungry for engagement and to think about their possibility. And that lasted for a while, and then gradually the hard realities, both of surviving after the collapse. People were really struggling to survive. I mean, I
Right.
met literally brain surgeons who were dealing cards in a casino, or nurses who were working as prostitutes, and all of that kind of thing that happened for people to survive. But the other thing was that
Vladimir Putin driving a taxi.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, but then the thing was that they also gradually started to understand the reality that maybe the West wasn't all it was cut out to be, and so there was a kind of, shall we say, growing disappointment and maybe rising cynicism about their place in the world.
When I first started spending time in Finland, which I was there because I discovered this nutty skiing event they have, where cross country skiing, where you ski from the Russian border to the Swedish border in the northern third of Finland. It's called Border to Border. I wrote a piece about it for Outside.
Yeah,
Utterly nutty, but great
and a
fun.
great piece, by the way, because I did see it, and
Oh,
and
it was great. It was absurd fun. But what really struck me, so this was, pre-invasion of Ukraine, or the main invasion of Ukraine, maybe 5 years ago. How much people thought and talked about Russia then.
mm,
In the
mm,
It was like this omnipresent sort of shadow,
yeah,
and there were some uh, uh, I call them kids on this trip, who were in university, who also were in the military,
yeah,
and I just, it's like, wow. I mean, Russia, really, and they, Finland never relaxed. They never gave up, and what they a country of 5.5 million, and they
yeah,
can have a
yeah.
standing army of
About 1 million, yeah,
about 1 million in
yeah.
48 hours or something.
I mean, look, they have an 835-mile border with Russia.
Yeah,
So that has always been true. They were an autonomous duchy of the Russian Empire, if you go back
right,
to, up until 1917, when they essentially got their freedom from Lenin, who said, like, we're not going to maintain this duchy anymore. And
right.
the thing is that the Finns fought two wars against the Soviets. They ended up giving up land, to the Soviets to maintain their independence. But they've always had this very fragile relationship with the Soviet Union and then Russia. I mean, I think the interesting thing I find is that, and I'm there almost every year. My wife is from Finland, and I have family that's there, and
Oh, wait.
and
So he's kind of buried the
Yeah.
lead here. So
Yeah.
moving to Finland permanently is an option for you if things
Were
really.
things to turn sufficiently
Yes,
south,
you.
that is a real
Yeah,
option.
I may
I'm
be
hoping
calling you
to,
and asked to be adopted. So just
yeah, that's
um,
always possible. I mean, look, it's perfect in the summer. You get 21 hours of daylight, so that has its upsides.
yeah. I'm obsessed
So
with the Winter War, which another whole episode. I'd love to talk about it. When the Russians invaded 1939,
yeah,
uh, thought it would be easy. I mean, I think, and the Finns defended like 4-1
mightily.
casualty rate. I mean, it's just an extraordinary feat of arms and sort of human courage and resilience.
Yeah, I'm convinced that Hitler's march to Moscow may have been influenced by his belief that the Russians were beatable because the Finns were so fierce in their success really at fending them off.
Yeah, and look, and before we leave, have you ever read a book, sort of a novel called Deep River
No.
by Carl Marlantes? Everybody should read this book. Carl Marlantes is, I think, a genius. He was from this small Oregon town that was a Finnish lumbering town. He's Finnish, second generation Finnish,
Mm,
or maybe first generation Finnish. Um, Smart guy, uh, went to Yale from this small high school, in Oregon. Uh, Became a Rhodes Scholar, and then we're talking 1969. Before going to Oxford, he enlisted in the Marines and became a first lieutenant and went to Vietnam. At a time when the survival rate of first
mm,
lieutenants in Vietnam was, under a month. And he survived, had an extraordinary war. And I knew people who knew him at Oxford and said he seemed, and then he went to Oxford. And it's the most amazing sort of like, wait, I know I got a Rhodes Scholar, but first I want to go to Vietnam.
yeah.
It's like, no, that most
No.
people just,
These things don't equate. Yeah.
yeah, it's like, what? And people say it was sort of really normal. James Fallows knew him at Oxford when he was a Rhodes Scholar. But then apparently he had this sort of decline, like so many of these, and became an alcoholic and would always talk about writing the great American novel about Vietnam. And then, damn, if like 25 or so, 30 years later, he did, called
Mm,
Matterhorn,
mm,
which is a work of, I mean, you can't read this and not think this is a work of genius.
mm,
But he then published a novel called Deep River, which is this sort of novel like Americans just don't write anymore. It's like Tolstoy,
mm.
of long novel about three generations of Finnish Americans.
Wow.
And it begins when Finland is still this Russian duchy. And it really, to escape from that, they first come to America and
Yeah.
they gravitate to Oregon because they're lumberjacks.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's just an amazing
Yeah. Yeah,
uh,
and look, I mean,
piece
I
of
just
work.
say two things, and maybe we can slide into politics. I mean, one of the things is that the Finns have always had this complicated relationship because of this, enormous neighbor and dangerous neighbor, and they're more nervous now than they ever are, based on at least conversations that I've had about how precarious their situation is with Putin's imperialism right now, and
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 join NATO.
well, they joined NATO, but we're NATO, it looks more fragile than it used to because of this this moron who's in the White House, and the thing is that you know how upside down our world is, that we have somebody sitting in the Oval Office who's convinced that Vladimir Putin and Russia are a model. I mean, a murderous dictator
I,
who has impoverished his people, who believes in using dictatorial power to control his country, and a country that has survived only because of its remarkable natural resources, has produces essentially nothing that goes to
yeah.
the world besides, as you know, literature and music, and culture, and that's the model for America's future.
I've been thinking lately, sort of law of unintended consequences when you have, two, one dictator, one would-be dictator. Putin ends up with NATO, with Finland and Sweden joining NATO. The last thing that he wanted.
Yeah.
Trump now has ended up electing a liberal government in Canada,
Yeah.
and and galvanizing um, the West
Yeah.
against America. It's extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, and look, I mean, look, you know, this is a complicated time. I think people are experiencing enormous amounts of stress and distress, fear, in some cases, despair, really serious and, legitimate worry about what the survival lifespan is for a democratic America. And it's, these are all real things, but the, the fact is, it's important to look at the world around us, to look at Canada and Mark Carney, who's pushing back, and Scheinbaum in Mexico, and the Germans, and the Europeans, all of our traditional allies who are standing up and who are, I look at as being part of our opposition to this, craziness. And so, so I don't know about you, but I take strength from all of that.
Yeah, I do too. I've been thinking a lot. We are coming up on May 8th, on the 80th anniversary of VE Day. And, you know, um, my dad spent 3 years fighting in the South Pacific. Like,
Mm,
my uncle fought, landed D-Day, fought, then was terribly wounded, never really recovered, but came back. I mean, there was like hundreds of thousands of others. He just had, they never, rarely talked about it. And you think about it, in those just extraordinarily moving cemeteries in Europe
mm,
where American and Canadian dead are buried, if they could come alive now and see that America now is on the side of the dictator invading a European democracy,
mm.
the thing that they left, small towns, big cities, to go die in places they couldn't pronounce,
Yeah.
to
Because there
defend.
was an idea and an ideal and values and principles, and a belief in democracy, which we took as a fundamentally American
Yeah.
notion, all thrown away for what?
You know, I mean, so what you think about this. I'm the most anti-conspiracy theory person in the world, but I don't think we talk enough about sort of, and maybe this isn't complicated. You have the first time Russia, hostile foreign power, actively intervened to elect a president
Yeah.
in 2016. There's no dispute about that.
No.
I don't know if it's awkward for Trump, probably not, but it was Marco Rubio's Senate Intelligence Committee that concluded that Russia intervened. All U.S. intelligence agrees. So this isn't a dispute, and they won.
Yeah.
So I mean,
And
beyond any,
then can we just go ahead to 2018, and then Trump, we're back to Helsinki, or back to Finland.
yes,
Trump goes to Helsinki and betrays America, betrays the findings of 17 intelligence agencies, and says, well, Putin says that they didn't do it, so why would I disbelieve him?
yeah, and then Putin hands him a soccer ball where he looks like a trained SEAL. It's a piece of footage we've dined out on quite robustly in the Lincoln Project.
Yeah,
Um, and think about, so you're an FSB colonel. You have this idea. We're going to do this. Prigozhin, the guy who led the Wagner Group, was at the heart of it. And then he went. It has to be the most successful covert operation in
mm,
history.
right.
I mean, say what you will about the Cambridge Five and all of that. They're Soviet Union was just trying to influence people around power. They weren't trying to say, okay, we're going to get the Queen or we're going to get Churchill
Right.
to be for not,
Right.
or to be communist. And that's what they've done. And I'm
I mean,
not the first.
Trump went to Moscow, and I believe it's 87.
Yeah,
He obviously was wined and dined by KGB, all the sort of right people that sort of knew how to, flatter this so-called rich businessman. Did they anticipate where this was going? I mean, it wasn't that long before he was coming back to America and raising doubts about NATO and all these other things. So I don't know whether he turned already then, or he
yeah.
was already so hostile to, the basic kind of principles of equality and justice that inspire most Americans. Who was so convinced by this, picture that he had that the world was always cheating him, and he had to do whatever he had to do because he was being ripped off. I mean, we're in this ridiculous trade war with the whole world right now because this guy is convinced that because Americans spend more money on buying goods from China, that it's the Chinese that are ripping us off rather than Americans wanting to buy their products.
it's
I mean, this
it's
is just, idiocy.
yeah, it's really short. A lot of books have been written about that Russian influence of Trump, but
Yeah,
one that I found was particularly powerful was by Craig Unger. I don't know if you know Craig, but
I
you
do.
probably,
Yeah,
yeah. I thought I can't remember the title. I think he's written a couple now.
yeah, he has.
Um, but it went a lot into the Russian shell uh, corps that were buying apartments in Trump Tower,
Yeah,
how it became this Russian mob laundering uh, laundromat. I mean, Trump Tower was basically a laundromat of Russian mob money. Um, and I'm not the first to say this. If you look at all this stuff that Trump's doing, this is crazy. But then there's one prism where it makes sense: is what would you do if you were a functional agent of Russia?
yeah.
And for the life of me, I can't find anything that he would do differently.
But look, I mean, so there's Trump, but then there's all the miscreants and sycophants that surround him. The cowardly and the spineless. And look, you famously wrote it was all a lie, and have revisited an earlier notion of a party that relies on principle for its decision making. So I'm quite clear sort of where you stand in that fundamental point. But I have to imagine that even now you're surprised by how willing
Um,
they've all been to go along with this pro Putin stuff.
I wrote a piece in the New Republic about a guy I've known most of my life, Roger Wicker, current senator from Mississippi. Roger and I, about the same age, grew up in Mississippi. We're both pages for Democratic congressmen in Washington. Our dads were in the legal world in Mississippi, and we're big pals. Um, I helped Roger. He was appointed to the Senate by Haley Barbour, another client of mine, and I helped Roger win a very tough Senate race
Mm.
in Mississippi, actually against a Democrat governor, the only Democrat governor we've had this century from Mississippi. And so here's Roger Wicker, a guy who, if there was one thread that connected his career from Congress to now chairman of the Armed Services Committee, his lifelong dream, it was the construction of a European American alliance that would stand to protect Europe, protect America against the Soviet Union and now Russia. I
Right.
mean, that was, yeah, he does regular stuff. He voted for this
Yeah.
bill, and that, but if you were to say, if you had asked Roger Wicker, what do you want to be the first paragraph of your obituary to be remembered for? I am confident that's what he would have said. And yet there he is, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, ushering in Pete Hegseth,
Yeah.
a guy literally Roger wouldn't let him cut his
Yeah. He
lawn.
knew better. Right.
It. And what I just find so extraordinary about this is it's such a voluntary smallness.
Mhm.
Had Roger Wicker said, "Look, there's a lot of conservatives out there. We're not asking you to put Dick Durbin as chairman of the defense committee. Just pick a conservative who is competent.
Yeah.
That's it. Who knows the military, who is there to make America safer." And and yet he didn't. And
I mean, Wicker is enough of a an adult, and has lived long enough that he can gaze backward toward 1945, and what hundreds of thousands of Americans, sacrificed lives for to be able to secure a democratic future, and 80 years of building alliances and building institutions that have given us relative security and stability. And then these guys go and put in a Hegseth
and
or a Tulsi Gabbard, and and they dismantle the cybersecurity and all of the basic structures that provide uh, uh, our ability to gauge what kind of intrusions may be going on. And back to your point about Russia, I mean, the readiness just to let them invade, and minimize our ability to even know what they're doing.
it, it's just extraordinary. Um, and you know, on a personal level, it's even hard for me to talk about. I getting emotional.
Yeah,
I just never would have thought it possible.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I just and
Heartbreaking.
I've tried to understand it, but
So come on, you've been you've worked with a lot of people who have operated at the highest levels of government, and
you got to
presidents
rub it in. Yeah.
and all of that. Surely you understand the hunger for power, and whether it's your own power or whether it's proximity to that power. So you know
Yeah.
the craven instinct is surely understandable, but again, this is hard for you to wrap your head around too.
What consistently baffles me is, I mean, most politicians have pretty big egos, right? So, I mean, great, so do writers, musicians, athletes. We haven't shot anybody all day for that. But why don't they think about how they are going to be seen?
Mhm.
We're not talking 50 years from now.
Yeah,
How are they going to be seen um, in the near future?
yeah,
My theory is that Trump appoints someone like Pete Hegseth, who he knows is a blithering idiot. He knows he is.
yeah.
Knows, he's a
But
drunk, a
he'll be
moron.
obedient.
He does it to
He'll do what
prove that
Esper didn't do, right? He's the one who will, when he says shoot the protesters in Lafayette Square in the legs, Hegseth will give
yeah,
the
he'll
order.
ask both legs or one leg.
Yeah,
Um, but I think Trump takes a evil, sick glee out of proving that he can make these U.S. senators vote for a moron who is a danger to the country like Pete Hegseth.
yeah,
And if there's one thing, I think that is consistent about Trump, uh, he has this animal instinct for weakness. And he looked at a guy who'd been, you know, maxed out donor to Democratic causes, was more of a Democrat than a Republican for a long time in New York. Say that's out of a convenience, out of social standing, whatever. But he was. He certainly wasn't a movement conservative. And, you know, uh, he saw that in 15 that if I promise the Republican Party power, if I can deliver them power, all of these things they said that they believe in, that they'll walk away, and not just walk away from, they
yeah,
will actively oppose.
yeah,
And he was right.
yeah. I mean, he
All of them,
understood. He
except a few. A
understood.
few. There are a few. Mitt, you have Adam, uh, Kenzie, Liz.
Yeah,
There are a few. Um, but I mean, it's a Republican Party where there's not room for a Cheney.
yeah.
I mean, think about that.
Yeah.
I
So let me ask you this. I mean, I think, look, I think you experience what I do, which is, a lot of people, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call, like asking the question, what do we do? And, what are the ways in which we respond? And, I'm interested in sort of two things in terms of your thinking. One, which is, I mean, there are elected officials. I'm thinking of a J.B. Pritzker. I'm thinking
Yeah.
about Cory
I
Booker.
thought the piece you wrote,
Uh,
if people haven't read that piece, I thought it
yeah,
was the most interesting piece that been written about him.
yeah.
I learned a lot about him and really had a whole different feel for him after I read your piece.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I more than anything, I cut and pasted what Pritzker had to say, and he's been one of, I think, just a small handful who have really grasped the urgency of the moment, and is able to give the historical context that goes right back to Nazi Germany, and looks at this moment, and feels like, it is a five-alarm fire, and we need to act accordingly, right? Not be tepid, not do nothing, not look the other way, not assume that we'll just play this out until the midterms, or let's look forward to 2028. I think there's a genuine alarm warning that's at the right level, and I think there aren't enough of the surely of the Democrats who are doing that. And I'm wondering, do you think, A, that there are solutions to be had from the elected officials? B, do you have hope because of the courts and I think in some cases, the very fierce role of a number of judges who've been able to
Right.
stand up, not
Some
only
Republican.
in individual rulings, but
Yeah.
also to sort of stand up for the principles of the Constitution and 250 years of a republic that's been committed to the separation of powers, and committed to trying to sustain the rule of law for the benefit of society. But and then the third part. So I'm giving you three parts: the elected officials, the courts, but then the streets. And in my view, the need for, Erica Chenoweth at Harvard talks about 12 million. She talks about 3.5% of a
Three and a
population.
half. See, I found that fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, which in the American context is 12 million
So
people.
just play that out for a second so people understand it. So
Yeah.
the theory is,
Well, the theory is, and this is based on the research of quite a number of countries, where the people were looking for some kind of political change, governmental change, some kind of a redress, and generally found that the ones that had the most ability to have an impact, and to in some cases topple a government, or to have very clear goals that led to redress of one form or another. Uh, it usually depended on having at least 3.5% of the country's population, and that it was nonviolent.
mm,
Those two characteristics were critical. And so, we're not there yet in the American context of 12 million people being on the street, as being a level that starts to make a difference, I think, ultimately, and probably not in a one-off, but I think ongoing, and where
ongoing.
the message and the purpose and the goals are clearly defined, which, at this point, there's so many, targets of discontent that I think we still haven't quite kind of concentrated the mind on. Is it the end of due process? Is it the deporting of, without due process, both migrants, and now it looks like the starting of the desire to kidnap and take hostage, in my view, American citizens as well. I mean, is it the dismantling of Social Security, so that suddenly, maybe one day soon, millions of Americans are not getting their Social Security payments? I mean, I don't know what the catalytic event is that finally concentrates Americans' attention, but it seems to me that that's the thing that has to happen before we actually have a chance to slow down, stem, change this really dangerous trajectory.
You know what? My um, um, belief and attitude toward all this is that the best fights are the one you get in, not because you know you're going to win, but because you have to fight. And I think the wrong question is this going to make a difference?
Mm,
The right question is, what else are you going to do? So everybody at every level in their life should, as much as they can, emotionally and in their structure of their lives, fight this. I mean, we do this in the Lincoln Project every day. We wake up looking to get in a fight.
yeah,
And I am not a fan of this process the Democratic Party is going through of sort of this identity crisis that the party is going through. You know, as a political consultant, right? You had
yeah,
an election. On election day, the right track for the country was at 27%. No incumbent party in modern history has ever won when it was lower than 45.
mm,
You had a president, incumbent president's approval was 40%. No incumbent party has ever gotten more than 2 points higher.
mm,
So it was a perfect environment for challenger to win. And we have data that shows, you know, like Nikki Haley, one of my least favorite people on the planet, would have done better.
yeah,
So I think that this is not to be confused with an endorsement of Trumpism.
right.
And you know, the people running the Trump
The mandate.
campaign that I used to work with, God help me. I probably brought up it in the Hague and war trials tribunal about it, but they understood that Project 2025 was poison
Yeah,
and did everything they could to get away from it. And now that people are having to drink that poison, it's not
yeah,
going down any easier.
yeah,
So, you know, I think this is kind of how people end up worshiping volcanoes. There's a drought, the volcano belches, it rains, and then next thing you know, you're hurling virgins into the volcano. I would not assume that there is some collapse of the Democratic Party's vision or goal that is at the root of this.
yeah,
You know, I think probably if, you know, most people would agree, you know, this idea of incumbent president getting out in July, going to maybe we shouldn't do that again,
mm,
you know? And
yeah. I mean, 3 months is not enough
yeah,
time.
well, you know, maybe it wasn't like the best
Yeah,
idea to throw out the primary process. Yeah. And look, I think we have to be honest with ourselves. The day after Hillary Clinton lost, I don't think many of us would have gotten together and said, well, damn, the next time we're going to run a black woman and that's going to fix this. I mean, there is such inherent racism and misogyny in America.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and I personally think the Harris campaign ran a brilliant campaign.
I do
And
too.
and they lost. But that
I do.
happens.
Yeah.
And, you know,
And like Hillary, Kamala Harris rang the alarm bell, right? She
yes,
articulated it quite clearly. This is a guy that was beholden to Moscow and responds to flattery and
as did Hillary Clinton.
go through issue by issue, and these things don't make sense. They don't make economic sense. They don't make sense for an actual democracy. All the things that she did. And I think, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of normalcy bias and a crisis of imagination. And I felt like before
I
the election, how do you expand people's imagination so that they can look forward to the future and understand the danger that they're in? And this bias, again, this normalcy
you
bias
know,
is this very specific notion that people underestimate the significance of a threat and they fail to grasp the extent of a coming disaster.
the problem with the unimaginable is it's hard to imagine. And I think that this is where American exceptionalism bites us in the ass.
Mhm.
That we think that because it's been this way for generations, that it will continue to be. Um, and there's absolutely no reason to think that that's valid. Um, I I think one of the
I think we're
struggles
still
here.
suffering from this. I mean, it's not like, oh, we got Trump and that's the end point of this. I think we people are continuing to 12 million in the streets, or counting on some official to fix this. I think it's part of the same mindset that,
I agree.
it's not that the problem isn't that enormous that we can't just fix it like we always have.
Yeah, I look. I think that uh, what Trumpism really isn't about Trump.
Mm.
It's about a darkness that has been part of American politics for a long time that now has been legitimized in a way that never occurred before. I mean, when I wrote It Was All a Lie, I really, I had to ask myself, why is it I didn't see this? And as I looked at the party, there was really two strands of the Republican Party in post-World War II Republican Party. Eisenhower, sane, governing, boring, and Joe McCarthy, uh, non-governing, racist,
Yeah,
xenophobic. And, I think, obviously, in retrospect, naively, those of us who worked for Bush, 43, we used to sit in the same room. Me, Nicole Wallace, Michael Gerson, who sadly died, a beautiful writer for the Washington Post,
mm,
Matthew Dow, Mark McKinnon. I think that we thought our idea of compassionate conservatism, or Bush's idea, we were the dominant gene.
yeah,
And if only because of necessity of politics, and America's changing so much, that it, we would emerge dominant. And I don't know any conclusion to come to, but we were wrong.
yeah,
We were the recessive gene,
yeah. I
and
mean,
the party is becoming what it wanted to be.
yeah. I mean,
Um,
you were envisioning that that as the demographic shifts were happening in the
yes,
country, becoming a less, white majority country, that the compassionate conservatism had to be more inclusive to be able to sustain itself and to be a leadership in the country. I mean,
yeah.
it makes sense, it
Like
does.
what fools were we? I mean, you forget Ken Bellman, chairman of the party in 2005, went before the NAACP and apologized for the Southern strategy. And, when Bush ran in 19, we started talking about compassionate conservatism. A lot of conservatives said to him, "So look, dude, are you trying to say that American conservatism is currently practiced and constructed is not compassionate?"
Yeah.
And his answer pretty much was yes. That's what I'm saying. And who knows, what Bush would have been like. I mean, but if you look at the first bill he did, really the only major bill, was No Child Left Behind,
Mm,
which, you can argue about the merits of that, but there is that famous photograph. He's signing it with Ted Kennedy over his right shoulder.
mm.
I mean, today that would be presented in a war crimes tribunal in the Republican Party. We have proof here, ladies and
Yeah.
gentlemen. Well, look, we could talk about this forever, but I I just think that your perspective on this, having lived in these different places, having seen these different things, is just so important for people because it is lack of perspective, I think, that led us into this.
Yeah.
I think, again, Trump has always benefited from the inability to imagine him. Uh, I couldn't imagine him
All
winning the
his life.
primary. I
All
couldn't
his life.
imagine him winning the general.
Yeah.
And I really couldn't imagine the America that we loved would go back to this felon who tried to overthrow the government, who is so clearly a racist and so clearly.
Yeah.
And I don't think we talk enough about the role of race in this, which is another whole, you got to promise me to come back and we'll do a whole thing. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. I
you know,
can I say that I've been going back and reading a lot of the accounts from right after the Emancipation Proclamation, and how
interesting.
enslaved people have, were struggling with freedom, right, and managing in society, and then sort of looking forward to those next years, which I guess in the worst sense, led to the combination of rising black legislators and people going to the voting booth and all of that, followed by the Ku Klux Klan going around and murdering people because they were trying to terrify, black voters and black legislators to remove them from any kind of role in the body politic, and so, I mean, thankfully you had, Ulysses. I'm doing a short thing here, but Ulysses S. Grant, who put in place the Justice Department at that time, and Ackman, who was that first Attorney General, who then, they had the Ku Klux Klan act that was to try to overcome all of this thing. But I find it both horrifying to go back and look at those times, and I also find it useful because it reminds me that as horrific as these times seem to be, and as dangerous as a moment as it is, it's not the first one, and maybe not the worst.
I'll just leave it with this. What really enrages me the most about these MAGA Republicans is there are people in America who were denied rights through murder, torture, rape, enslaved, and they didn't storm the Capitol.
Yeah,
They registered voters,
yeah,
and they kept at it, and they kept at it, and they kept at it. And if you go back to January 6th, 2021, the efforts to decertify these places, they were all, what do they have in common? Atlanta,
mm,
Philadelphia, Detroit. It's where
yep,
a lot of black people live.
yep, yep,
And that it was just Jim Crow
yeah,
denial of vote taken to another level.
yeah. They're all
And
just
yeah, and I don't look in 2020, Trump's coalition was 85% white in a country that's 59% white, and less so since we've been talking. So there's been a lot made, too much since different conversation, about Republican Party's ability to make inroads with non-whites. So yeah, Trump did better in 24. This time, instead of 85% of his coalition being white, it was 84%. In a country that is becoming a minority majority country.
right.
And all the Stephen Millers in the world is not going to stop that now.
Yeah, yeah,
And it, I find it difficult. Another conversation, the language to talk about this,
mm,
about the whole issue of how do we talk about it and not sound crazily alarmist?
yeah.
How do we talk about it in a way that really communicates with people?
Can we have that conversation?
Yes,
I
I would
think
love
we
to. Promise to come back, and we'll do
Yeah,
that.
let's do that, and dig into some of those things. And I just want to say, anyone who's listening, I mean, pay attention to Stuart Stevens. I mean, this is a thoughtful person who looks at the world and looks at it soberly. And you could be, as I was suggesting, deeply cynical, but instead, you obviously continue to care for your country and care about the fight. And I couldn't agree more that the responsibility that everyone has. Individual actions, you may doubt whether they're going to be what we need to win in this moment, but they matter. They matter now. They matter in the long run, and we
Yeah.
will. I believe we will see our way through this, and it'll depend upon people being able to hold on to democratic values and principles, and a belief in a genuine America that cares about the things that were and are contained within the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, there's nobody out there who's gonna save us, as,
Yeah,
you were saying earlier.
yeah,
Well, look, thanks everybody for joining us. Um, Definitely subscribe, paid subscription if you can, for Stephen's, Substack, America. Follow Lincoln Square. You can subscribe. You know, again, another conversation I'd love to have with you, Stephen, about the crisis in journalism when we have a
yeah,
generation of journalists who were raised to believe the greatest good was objectivity.
yeah, yeah.
And
We're
how do you
we're
tell
we're
both
suffering
sides
the
of the lie?
crisis.
And you and I both have seen so many friends of ours struggle with that.
Yeah,
Um, and I don't think there is an answer to it yet. So I think that's one of the reasons these alternative medias have come up so much.
yeah, yeah. 100%.
Um, all right. Well, thanks everybody, and thank you, Stephen. And
Thank you, Stuart.
look
See you next.
forward to talking soon.
With
All,
pleasure.
all the best.
Likewise.